A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
On a Monday, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby. Michelle Pearse is the CEO of the Australian Christian Lobby. Hey, Michelle, welcome back to 2020.
Hi, Neil. Great to be here.
Michelle, there's always lots of issues to cover, but let's start with the New South Wales Greens push for abortion. It seems to be there's no end. There's no... in some ways, they've got an insatiable appetite for basically killing children here. Give us your thoughts on developments around the New South Wales Greens.
Yeah, exactly. You think that now that we've got abortion to birth with no restrictions everywhere in the nation, that there wouldn't be more they could do. But certainly they're wanting to expand access to abortion by widening the pool of providers and forcing medical professionals, nurses and midwives who are conscientious objectors to violate their conscience and force them really to participate in abortion. So that's what this bill does. And it's for the prescription and referral as it relates to the drug that induces miscarriages, which is abortion, ending the life of the baby in utero. So what the Greens have found is that in New South Wales towns and mainly in rural areas, that abortion services are limited because of conscientious objection. So to be able to provide more abortions across more of New South Wales, particularly in these rural areas, they need to remove the conscientious objection of those faithful midwives and nurses to force them to refer patients for medical abortions. This is really sad if you think about, perhaps you or I, Neil, if we're in that situation where somebody came to us asking for an abortion, if we were within the medical field, it would be against our conscience to even refer somebody to have an abortion or to go and get a medical termination, which is the same as abortion. So this is a violation of conscientious objection, which is a human right. So our message to New South Wales Parliament is this isn't about whether you're pro-life or pro-abortion. This is about whether you are pro-human rights, in that, conscientious objection is a human right and something that Australia is a signatory to in terms of our international obligations. And so to force somebody to act contrary to their conscience is an abuse of human rights. And so this bill needs to be opposed by Labor and all New South Wales parliamentarians on this basis.
Conscientious objection, and the ability, if you're working in the health industry, in health care, and you're put on the spot and you're called on to help in the abortion of a baby, in some sense, some might be saying you'll have blood on your hands. So really not just going according to what others say, but actually having a conscience in which you can actually make a decision and be strong and say, no, that's not what I'm going to do. That's going to be very, very important. And at a time, Michelle, when New South Wales Health already struggles with severe staffing shortages, this is likely to affect people who are thinking of a health career, and they might be thinking twice.
Exactly. And this is so top of mind for me because just recently I was speaking to a female medical student who she wants to be a midwife because she feels called to help women deliver their babies and to help mothers. She's a young, bright lady. And she was speaking to me about reconsidering her career choices because she thinks that she might be forced in a position where she has to quit in order to protect her conscience, because she will be one of those who would refuse to participate in any part of the abortion process. So if you've got good Christian medical practitioners in these rural areas, and within these regional areas there is a high proportion of Christian people, they'll leave the industry because of this, which will cause New South Wales Health to suffer even more. So I think the Greens, perhaps they underestimate or perhaps they don't, but the depth of the Christian conviction around this issue. They want anybody who will, hold by their convictions to conscientiously object to leave the health industry, which would be damaging for New South Wales Health, particularly in these rural areas, which are, as you say, already under pressure.
Taking this to maybe a logical conclusion, if you run policy and you make this sort of impression upon your workers that they must participate in abortion, there is a sense, isn't there, that ultimately you will cause those who have that compassionate Christian foundation to their healthcare, they will leave the industry. Now, if everyone leaves the industry and you're left with a whole bunch of secularised healthcare workers, what does that mean, do you think, for the level of healthcare you'll get insofar as that compassionate sense that we all hope for if we're going to be getting treated? The end product of this is really very significantly serious, isn't it?
Exactly. And it doesn't end at abortion when you think of euthanasia and perhaps what the world sees as the economic cost of looking after elderly patients. We see many European nations move to expanding access to euthanasia to, dementia patients or even patients suffering mental conditions like depression. So we need Christians in the industry to hold the line on many of these ethical issues. And if Christians abandon the health industry, then it's going to be a far darker place and a place where patients aren't going to feel safe.
Okay, and in a culture like ours, where convenience is being valued above the dignity of every human life, we've got a real challenge, haven't we? Hey, let's move on. There's lots of things to cover because the Western Australian state election is coming less than 2 weeks from now on the 8th of March. Pre-poll voting actually started today, and ACL has been working with those candidates and parties to get some commitments on some levels of where they stand on various policy issues. What can you update us on so far as WA?
Yeah, well, our clear message, a very simple message to the public, because Labor have been moving in this direction, is Labor thinks men can be women. And we actually have leaflets going out into marginal seats across Western Australia with this message because the Labor government recently passed self-sex ID laws, which allows passports and birth certificates to be compromised. But further to that, it puts women's sports and safe spaces at risk. It puts public toilets and change rooms at safety risk for women. So this is further entrenching a fallacy that men can be women and that this really has no consequences for society. This has huge consequences for society, and we're seeing nations across the world move away from this kind of ideology, but Labor are forging ahead into it. The Labor government have it within their power, as we've seen over in Queensland, to ban puberty blockers, but they're ignoring the evidence and young people are continuing to be harmed. So where there is a clear distinction to be made between Labor policy and Liberal policy, we'll make that known. So Libby Mettam, who's the leader of the WA Liberals, has said that she will ban puberty blockers if the opposition is elected. And she also said that they will repeal the self-sex ID law. And her quote was that they will ensure people can't change their sex on birth certificates. So soon after the election, it's also likely that Labor will implement conversion therapy laws, which we know risks the freedom of the church to uphold a biblical sexual ethic or pray for people that are struggling with their gender identity or sexual orientation. So, these are serious matters. These aren't just sideline issues. This is the redefinition of fundamental truths that will affect our future society. So I really hope that West Australians, not only Christian Western Australians, but these leaflets with Labor thinks men can be women, will be in many letterboxes of people not of faith, but that it will move hearts and minds to consider the seriousness of these issues and also what it means for their children at school and what they're being taught. So we're hoping that this really does influence the way that people vote.
Well, going back historically now, the opposition in WA has been so weak and no backbone at all, which is why there's so few opposition MPs in WA. Of course, there's just an overwhelming number of seats for the ALP. It's highly unlikely, I suspect, that there'd be a change of government, but certainly there'd be WA listeners right now who might actually have a little bit of, might feel a little heartened by the idea that Libby Mettam actually is going to stand for some pretty solid things here that are really very much opposite side to where the Labor government's going. Is there a little bit more backbone, do you think, in the opposition in WA?
And I think you're absolutely right on your reflections on the state of the WA Liberal Party. But I can attest to the fact that there's some really good, solid Christian MPs in the Liberal Party that have been agitating for change, and that this has been a successful movement. And there is a number of really good, solid candidates on the ballot paper. Also, the Australian Christians have organised themselves and are likely to get a seat in the upper house as well. So I think that there'll be a big swing against Labor, and I just hope that there's enough good people elected, certainly in the upper house, to block some of these bad moves by the Labor government to continue to pass anti-freedom type laws. And we will see the stem of this bad legislation curtailed through the influence of the upper house if the Libs don't win government.
Okay, and parties like Australian Christians, I know they're hopeful of a seat in the upper house there in Western Australia. Hey, you've got Jacob Hill. He's your new guy who's taken on the WA state directorship for the Australian Christian Lobby. He's no doubt been working very hard with the WA Votes website. And so for listeners today, especially those in WA, want to get an insight into what's really going on behind the scenes and from that Christian view of the world, no doubt that's worth having a look at. So WA Votes, or just acl.org.au/WA Votes. These websites are particularly important, Michelle. This one for WA and of course a federal election on its way too, for listeners to access lots of great insight from the ACL website. That's just getting more and more important, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yes, please, listeners in Western Australia, go to wavotes.org.au and you'll see a range of comparisons of party positions on there to help you make an informed vote. And we need to get this message out to the church and Christian community across Western Australia so that they really go to the ballot box informed of the party's positions.
Okay, a quick update on developments in Victoria, because Victoria's anti-vilification bill, that sort of sounds nice in some sense, but there's a few sinister things in there. What's the update there?
It's a terrible bill. It's definitely not going to strengthen community cohesion. It's going to lead to further divisiveness. If it really was a bill that was to guard against anti-Semitism or push against it, create better enforcement or whatever, it's certainly not doing that, because what they've done is they've put within the bill a whole lot of other protected attributes that makes this much more a bill about LGBTQ advancement, more so than the protection of Jewish people. So one of the areas in the bill, which I'll just touch on because this is something we're seeing across Australia, is this movement to redefine what a reasonable person is in law. So I'll just talk about that just for a brief moment, because reasonable person is a term often used in law to refer to an average member of society who is of sound judgment. So this is meant to be an objective test. But to include what's now in the Victorian bill, which is that the reasonable person must be a person with the protected attribute. So that means that the test of reasonableness it's not based on objective reasonableness of an average person, but on the subjective reasonableness of somebody in the affected group. So if this bill, which it does, include trans and drag queens as a protected attribute, if you think of the Lyle Shelton case, Lyle Shelton simply said drag queens are dangerous role models of children. So an average person with sound judgment would reasonably conclude that his comments are reasonable. And many people in society would agree with him. But the question is, would a drag queen agree with him? And so with this amendment, with this in law, the reasonable person is somebody with the attribute. It means that a person with that attribute, the drag queen defines whether or not it is reasonable, or the trans person determines whether or not it is reasonable. So it really does lower the threshold and makes people that are accused of perhaps what Lyle Shelton said in Victoria would be at risk of being brought before the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, and that's dangerous for all of us.
Wow, and that's just an eye-opener when you talk about just the ways that the wording within legislation is fine-tuned in such a way to work against what we might think of as common sense or a Christian view of the world. That's so significant. Hey, just over a week ago, the US Vice President J.D. Vance delivered a speech to the Munich Security Conference, and he shocked the world, and especially everybody who was there watching him, saying the greatest threat facing the continent, talking about Europe, was not from Russia and China, but from within. What do you think that sort of speech might mean for us here in Australia, Michelle?
Yeah, it was a brilliant speech, and I encourage all listeners of Vision to go on to YouTube and find that speech, because I wholeheartedly agree with everything he said, completely aligned with it. He articulated it brilliantly. And like you said, he said that the biggest security threat facing Europe wasn't Russia or China, which is really what the Munich Security Conference you would think they'd be dealing with. But he took the opportunity to talk about the threat from within. And he said that the crisis facing Europe is one of its own making. And that is the retreat from its most fundamental values and the values that it's supposed to share with the US. And so he went on to talk about the Cold War and how the Cold War was a time when Europe opposed the tyrannical forces who censored dissidents, that closed churches, that cancelled elections. And he said that they lost because the other side lost because they neither valued nor respected the blessings of liberty, the freedom to surprise, to make mistakes, to invent and to build. And that was his words. And he said, looking to Europe, it looks more like old entrenched interests hiding behind ugly Soviet-era words like misinformation and disinformation. We hear those words here in Australia too. And he said, who simply don't like the idea that somebody with an alternative viewpoint might express a different opinion or, God forbid, vote a different way, or even worse, win an election. And then he goes on to talk about the positive vision, that we need a shared value system that articulates a positive vision for the future. And he believes that there's no security in these nations if you're afraid of the people's voices, their opinions and their conscience, that's supposed to be a guide for their people. So this is so true. And considering what we're facing in Australia, this speech really is a stake in the ground, not only for what's happening in Europe, but what's happening all over the world, and especially here in Australia.
He made comments about a lot of issues that we'd classify as culture war issues, and that suppression of free speech. He was blaming the continent for mass migration, and he accused its leaders of retreating from some of their most fundamental values. And these things, while we might think of them as a little bit intangible, the way you think about the world, eventually those things do actually become legislation and affects things economically as well. What are your thoughts about how our relationship with Europe might go, and even for things like tariff negotiations and things like that? How does that sort of fit, given, the challenge there?
Yeah, certainly. I think it has a big impact across the board on how nations form their laws, treat their citizens in relation to then how they will form relationship with a Trump presidency. And J.D. Vance goes through examples, like you said, these have tangible consequences of this worldview of thinking that you need to censor dissidents to the prevailing ideology. He pointed to how European governments have imposed the same tyranny from the Cold War against their own people, and gives real examples about how in Brussels, citizens have been warned that social media may be shut down during times of civil unrest the moment that they spot what they've quoted as hateful content. Or in Germany, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of combating misogyny. In Britain, J.D. Vance talks about a 51-year-old man who was charged with the heinous crime of standing 50 metres from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. And then he talks about Scotland, how the government began distributing letters to citizens warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. And he said that the government urged readers to report any fellow citizens suspected guilty of thought crime. Now, this isn't so far from the reality of what's happening in Australia, and our laws are being set up and bills are being pushed through right now that set us up for similar types of practical demonstrations. As I mentioned, the Lyle Shelton case, but we know of the case of Jasmine Sussex, who simply made the comment that men can't breastfeed. She got accused of vilification. Gillian Spencer up there in Queensland was stood down for refusing to give a autistic boy puberty blockers. So this is happening right on our doorstep, and we need to look to the US and see how they're now moving against it, and really consider our relationship with the US. J.D. Vance actually said, if you're not running in fear of your own voters, there is nothing America can do for you, nor for that matter is there anything that you can do for the American people who elected me and elected President Trump. And I think this statement is really saying that they are standing on a freedom platform. And this will, as you said, impact international relations and trading relationships. Because if they perceive Australia as a nation that partakes in abuses of human rights, that will affect our relationship with them. And when the Labor Party was pushing for a misinformation bill, a Soviet-style misinformation bill, what kind of relationship would an anti-freedom Labor government pushing forward these laws, not only federally but within their states, what kind of relationship will that mean for us and the US? And I think this would even have implications on us economically. So it's something we need to seriously consider, and certainly in the lead up to the election we'll be exposing what those anti-freedom types of legislation are, how they affect our everyday freedoms, and what direction it's heading in. As J.D. Vance said, Soviet-style censorship is a reality here in Australia too.
And, when we talk about governments being afraid of the voters, there needs to be that sort of fear of the voters, that if you go and legislate things that are completely against common sense, completely against the values that you may understand to be essentially true, as we do as Christians, then if governments are not afraid of what the voters will say, they'll legislate anything that they want. Interesting little development, of course, what's been happening overnight in Germany. Their election's been underway, and Germany's opposition Conservative Christian Democratic Union Party has been projected to win the national election. That would put the leader, Friedrich Merz, on track to be the next chancellor. That's what the exit polls are showing. So lots of distance still ahead in all of that. And of course, if he does win the majority, he's still going to have to forge a new coalition government. So there's lots of things unfolding in Germany. But what it appears to be, Michelle, and I'll just get your comment just briefly here, but it appears that German voters are tired of what's been going on, all of the wokeness in government, and they're making their voice known through the ballot box.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you have your far-right party, which was suspected to win more of a vote than the Christian Party, but the Christian Party got ahead, and perhaps it's in the question of approach in terms of how they're going to do the job of unwinding the damage that's already been done in Germany. And whoever wins is, if it's going to be on the right, which it looks like it's going to be, it's going to have a big job ahead of them in, like I said, unwinding, repealing, rescinding the laws, and changing culture to be one that celebrates freedom. And I think that Germans and Europeans are agitating for this change, and the government has to have ears to listen to the people, and that's what J.D. Vance's message was. They need to respect the views of the voters as they're doing in the US, and not impose a tyrannical censorship-style government or regime, which has been the status quo across Europe and under the Joe Biden administration, and now also in Australia.
Well, Michelle Pearse, always so good. It's such an important update we do each week with you here on 2020. And for listeners to connect with Michelle, you can do so through the ACL website, acl.org.au. And certainly for WA voters, the WA Votes link that you'll find there, and just type in WA votes on your Google and you'll find that website, insight into what's going on all of the different sides, different campaign strategies, the policies of not only the government but also the opposition and the minor parties as well. acl.org.au. Michelle Pearse, thanks so much for your update today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.